Hi, I'd like to talk a little bit about a particular passage in the Bible that pertains to women. This is called Woman Rise Up. 1 Corinthians 11:3 says, "But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God." What does this sentence mean? When I was a Christian, I viewed every instance here of the word head in the exact same light, which I believe is the only way to interpret the word. After all, the context is what it is. It doesn't change depending on the being to whom the word head refers. Thus, if we say God the Father is the head of Christ, and Christ came to do the Father's will, even though it meant Christ had to die, and if we say the man is to do the will of Christ, even if it requires the man's death, then we must of necessity also proclaim that the woman must do the will of the man, even to the point of death, right? According to the Bible, the woman is to stay with her husband, even if he beats her, and thus risk losing her life. Ephesians 5:22 tells women to submit to their husband as unto the Lord. Since one must be faithful to the Lord unto death, the woman is obligated to do the same for her husband. Also, the Bible tells servants to suffer beatings patiently, even when they've done nothing wrong, and wives are told to do likewise. So, we must maintain a consistent meaning of the word head. It means what it means. We can't say, well, yes, Christ had to do everything Yahweh said, and man has to do everything Christ says, but it doesn't work for the woman in her subjection to the man. If that were the case, these three relationships would not be equated. After all, nobody says Christ could ignore his Father's commands, and nobody says men may ignore Christ's commands. So what kind of hubris does it take to declare that a woman may ignore her husband's commands? Unless the word head means the same for the woman in her obedience to the man, the whole comparison in this passage falls apart and is useless. But some would say obedience and subjection are not the true concern in the word head. What then is the meaning of head in the Christian's life? What does it mean for the man, and what does it mean for the woman? Perhaps head simply means, perhaps it simply refers to source. According to the Bible, the man is indeed the source of the woman, as she was made from his rib. Man, of course, was created by Christ, in that Christ was with God in the beginning, and all things were made by him. But if source is what is being considered, in what way could Yahweh possibly be the source of Christ? Was Christ made by Yahweh? Well, the Bible does say he was the beginning of God's creation. At least Revelation 3:14 says that someone named Ammon was the beginning of the creation of God. Ammon was an important Egyptian god. And if the book of Revelation is equating Jesus with the god Ammon, then Jesus was the beginning of God's creation. Now, one might argue that this means Jesus was the head of the creation, or he, along with the Father, began the creation. And I think that's a fair point. Christ is called the everlasting Father and the mighty God. He is said to be equal with the Father. If Yahweh is his source, what happens to Christ's equality with God, or to Christ actually being God and worthy of worship? If Christ is an eternal, and his source is not in and of himself, then how is he God at all? Is he a lesser or lower God, a weaker God, a being somewhat like Satan or one of the angels? The idea of the meaning of head as being source makes no sense when it comes to Jesus in reference to Yahweh, if indeed Jesus is God. So I think that idea can be dismissed. I believe, therefore, that we must accept that the word head refers not to source, but to authority. And we know from other biblical passages that women are indeed to be in subjection to their husbands. Therefore, let's talk about that a little more. Jesus came into the world at his Father's bequest. He said he came only to do the Father's will. His M.O. was to think not of his own will, but only of the Father's. He came for the very purpose of dying at his Father's insistence. Yes, he tried to get out of it. He begged, he pleaded. But Yahweh said no, so Jesus willingly laid down his life in obedience. He died at the command of his Father. And we know, as stated above, that Jesus expects the same of men. A man's purpose is solely to follow in the steps of Jesus and do his bidding. A Christian man asks Jesus to guide him and give him wisdom. He rises each morning declaring, all of thee and none of me. His whole purpose is to be pleasing to Christ. He tries not to make a move without consulting Jesus and waiting on the Lord to give him insight and plans for his day. He wants his every action to be pleasing to Jesus and according to the desires of Jesus, but also to be the very thing that Jesus wants from him above all else. Jesus is his Lord and Master. A Christian man lives for Jesus. Now, where does that leave the woman? In verse 9 of 1 Corinthians 11, we read that woman was made for man. In the beginning, her role, her very reason for being created, was to be a helper to the man. So the woman's only purpose is to do the will of the man. If this is not so, then the man's purpose is not to do Christ's will, and Christ's purpose was not to do Yahweh's will. All of these have to work, or none of them do. The woman, then, should rise every morning seeking guidance from her husband, asking him to impart his will, begging him to guide her footsteps so she doesn't stray from his desires. She should always be eager to please her man, proclaiming all of thee and none of me. She must obey her husband unto death. He is her head, after all. And if she is to obey him as he obeys Christ, then her obedience has to be total and complete. 1 Peter 3, 1 through 6 says a woman is to obey her husband even to the point of calling him Lord. She should make her highest priority to seek and to do what is pleasing to her Lord, her husband, her head. For the man, not Christ, is the woman's head. This, I believe, is what the Bible teaches. It's what I taught when I was a Christian. But I was laughed at and scorned. I was told that I was trying to turn women into children. Well, aren't Christians to become like little children in their obedience to Christ? Didn't Christ obey his Father in the same way a child would obey? Then why wouldn't a woman do the same in her obedience to her husband, who is her Lord and her head? And by the way, servants are told to obey their masters in all things. And children are admonished to obey their parents in all things. Nobody bats an eye at those commands or tries to deny them. So why attempt to rebuff or weaken the concept that women are to do likewise, calling their husbands Lord and being obedient to their husband's commands? There is no reason in the world except a rebellious attitude to do such a thing. If the church is married to Christ and must therefore be obedient because the church is the wife, and therefore the body rather than the head, then why in the name of logic would a woman's obedience not be on the same level with regard to her husband's commands? As with the head analogy, the marital comparison works or it's useless. Now, is my goal here to convince Christian women to comply with their scriptures and be obedient to their husbands, living their lives in subservience, voting for whatever candidate their husbands support, always cooking meals their husbands enjoy, even if it's food the women can't bear to eat themselves, wearing clothes their husbands like, fixing their hair as their husbands request, praising their husbands no matter what these men do? Well, this would be in accordance with biblical teaching. The Bible is clear about how people are to dress. Christ makes demands regarding the clothing his followers are to wear, and Yahweh was quite specific about both clothing and the foods his people were to eat. He also instituted rules and regulations as to the food or sacrifices they served him. And certainly, no matter what horrible behavior comes out of Yahweh, his people are to praise him. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Therefore, if a man tells his wife what to wear, how to fix her hair, not to wear makeup or jewelry, to work full time, not to work outside the home at all, or even if he bellows to her, "Woman, rise up at 4 a.m. every day and pick wheat, grind it, and make me fresh bread," she should obey if she wants to follow the Bible. Surely, if her husband can die for Christ and Christ can die for Yahweh, she can at the very least rise up at 4 a.m. and make bread for her husband's breakfast and patiently accept a beating if she refuses. And by the way, none of that goes against the will of Christ or Yahweh, so she can't even cry, "It's better to obey God rather than men." But no, that is definitely not my goal here. Men are not more capable of making wise decisions for a family than women are. And some men can lead a family to ruin if left to their own devices. My desire is that women look at the Bible, not just the passages mentioned here, but many, many more, and come to understand that the Bible is sexist and misogynistic and is written by men and for men in order for men to have power over women. My goal is to help women see that they have a head on their own shoulders and they don't need a man to be a second head. My hope is that one day women will break their shackles and be free. And maybe, just maybe, one way of helping them to do this is to point out these atrocities presented in the Bible and help women see just how heinous they are. Maybe then they will reject this book that denies their worth and places them at the feet of men. And maybe then they will be free. Thank you. Bye.